Thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure and an honor to be with you today. Deep appreciation to Norad and to the government of Norway for this invitation. I've been asked to address three basic questions, and the first has to do with what were the major turning points in that journey of the SDGs. I would like to just say, as we reflect and we look at that UN building lit up when it was lit up and really galvanizing the entire world around the SDGs, that somehow the SDGs seem an inevitable, relentless, and logical development of the international development agenda. But actually, I want to say that for Colombia, when we started to propose this agenda at the end of 2010, beginning of 2011, the biggest surprise that we had was the implacable opposition, the very aggressive opposition, even in many cases, that we had to this proposal. We were accused of diluting responsibilities on global issues, of wanting to derail the MDGs, which had not yet been finished. There was unfinished business that we wanted to keep unfinished. And we were accused of wanting to undermine the poverty eradication agenda. And this, mind you, both by developing as well as developed countries. So the first key lesson that I would take is that to drive really deep change takes coalitions and takes champions. From the very, very beginning, Norway was a key partner in the evolution of the idea of the SDGs and in the negotiations. The process was very complex and very multifaceted, and Colombia relied on a small cohort of friends, of governments, that helped us to tackle the issues and the barriers as we moved ahead. A really main concern that we had at the beginning was that the SDGs would undermine the very basic issues that are at the core of the MDGs. One of the many tools that we used, and we were very creative, were small dinners where negotiators from developed and developing countries could come together to talk very frankly, in particular about ODA flows, which was the main concern on both sides. And just I want to start off by sharing this anecdote because it's very relevant to today's conversation. In one of these dinners, an African colleague jumped up and gave a very fiery and very impassioned speech about how developed countries that had not lived up to their promises were going to use the SDGs as a ploy to reduce funding for the MDGs. He was really quite bitter and quite impassioned. And there was this dead silence, and then Marianne Lowe, your Marianne Lowe, spoke up very quietly with that clear, sharp precision that she has and explained how Norway had always lived up to its commitments. And there was, again, a long silence. And he stood up, he was a very big man, leaned across the table and said, "You know what? I believe you, because Norway has always delivered." And there was just, if there was one of those moments that I wish I could have had a video of as we were negotiating the SDGs, was that moment, because that's where we started to change the conversation and change the trust and get an understanding of the potential for the SDGs. So this is to say that you need partners like Norway to be able to deliver on these agendas. Second point I would say is that it was really turbulent. You sort of have this sense that it was a snowball effect and we started talking about the SDGs, it gained momentum. It wasn't like that at all. There was very bitter opposition even to the last ends of the negotiation. It almost got derailed the last night of the negotiations. And it wasn't just an argument and a fight against the SDGs. There were real deep arguments against the very concept of the open working group, which is what actually made it possible to deliver on the SDGs. So a second lesson that I take away from this is that when we are at a crossroads, like the ones we are today, we have to be really cognizant of the depths of the inertia, of the depths of the opposition and the complacency that exist across all countries and across all spectrums. And this is really sobering because when we think of the kind of structural and systemic shifts that we're calling for, it's a wake-up call to how hard and how difficult that road ahead is. So the question is, how can the SDGs really lay the groundwork for these radical shifts? And I want to highlight three. One is an understanding that development is not a zero-sum game, that if you actually factor in the gains and the dividends, the trade-offs among and between sectors and between different levels, if you can address the externalities in an upfront way, if you can especially manage the long-term trade-offs in a proactive way, then these multi-sectoral and multi-dimensional approaches become the norm. And that's the first lesson, I think, of the potential of this agenda that we have crafted together. The second is that it is truly a universal agenda, and this is relevant and actionable by all countries, and that was revolutionary. We managed to get that also into the Paris Agreement, but I think the SDGs laid the groundwork for this idea of universality. And that's one that really acknowledges, and I think I like to think of the SDGs as a renovation of the social pact with which we signed on to the UN Charter. This is a renovation of that trust, of that faith, of that commitment to a global agenda, where we know that the interdependencies of poverty eradication, of cybercrime, terrorism, trade, transport, you name it, have no boundaries. So that's a second lesson. And I think a third lesson is the fact that there is a commitment to making equity a driving force for our understanding of what viable and acceptable growth is. The Leave No One Behind agenda is incredibly powerful, and I feel very privileged to be later sharing a panel with Homi Karas, who played such an important role in helping to shape that agenda. We see that the top drivers that have been identified by the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report shine the light on three very and profoundly interrelated phenomena. And so, to me, the question, and there was a question I asked when we were negotiating the SDGs, is how do we make the gains against poverty really irreversible? I'm not interested in poverty eradication by itself. I want to make sure that they're irreversible, which leads me to the second question, which is how do we avoid creating the conditions that can generate tomorrow's poverty? And that's really at the heart and at the core of the SDGs, because this will mean accounting for a burgeoning middle class, a global middle class, an enormous and massive youth bulge in regions that are already in many ways struggling and underserving, and doing this within the limits of resource availability and of the carbon budget. And in this sense, I think that the just transition, which is another concept that has come up quite forcefully and is very relevant to this agenda, speaks to the need to apply both to those whose livelihoods will lose out to market forces, as we will see probably in COP24 in Poland really play out, but also those whose livelihoods are eroded or destroyed and who are displaced by relentless climate impacts. So the agendas that we are calling for are really radical, and the complete decarbonization of the economy over the coming decades will call for major disruptions of both our economic and our financial systems. And if we don't do that, we're going to also see very major social disruptions. And delivering on equity essentially means delivering and tackling the imbalances of our current economic growth models and expectations. It's not just going to take hold of economy, as we like to say in the climate world. I think it's going to take what I like to call whole-of-globe approaches. So what do we need to be able to get everybody to sign on to this agenda and to deliver on it? And that's, I think, a very timely conversation that we're having today in this Norad annual conference. I think that I would argue that the private sector is already far more energized and committed to the SDGs than they were to the MDGs. There were some really highlights of commitment, and we were just talking about Gavi, so there was really great commitment around the MDGs, but it was punctual, and what we're seeing right now is a much broader cross-section of private sector. Engagement and delivery and interest in the SDGs, in some cases even more than governments. But I would say it's just the beginning. We need things, for example, to advance carbon pricing. We're seeing very good progress in some geographies, but at a scale, it would become a game changer. We also need to really look not just at the need to mobilize additional financing. We like to speak about the million to the trillions, and John just referred to the need to make sure that private finance is really catalytic, and that is true. But we also very urgently need to ensure that we redirect flows to ensure that they are sustainable and that they are Paris compatible. The total infrastructure needs for the next 15 years to 2030, 13 years now, to 2030 are estimated at around $90 trillion. In Africa, for example, the severe shortage of essential electricity infrastructure is undermining efforts to deliver more rapid social and economic outcomes. And yet 75% of that energy infrastructure has yet to be built. And the question is, under what parameters and how will it be built? And while we have seen incredible uptake in the renewable energy across many markets, we see in 2015, it was the first year in which investments in renewable energies by developing countries outpaced those from developed countries. And yet investments in many of the other key areas of the SDGs are still lagging. We see, for example, in energy efficiency, in transport, in agriculture, and something that where Norway has had a great leadership, which is tackling deforestation. There, we really need to see a lot more investment, and investment of the right kind. So I think a really quick question is how these private funds and public funds can be invested, deployed, and be made more catalytic. I think the task force on climate-related financial disclosures and initiatives of that kind will be really important to help correct misallocations of capital that result from failing to understand the implications of climate change. And I see within the donor community a lot of momentum to align their portfolios with both climate as well as SDG imperatives. But a lot more leadership is needed because we need the MDBs, we need other donors to really show the kind of leadership and the kind of guidance, the kind of transformation that can help governments move forward. The MDBs have adopted these common principles for their climate finance, but a much more comprehensive approach is needed in the finance community to align the climate and the SDG agendas. And this is really a set of opportunities. I think Norad is very much leading the way in showing by example with the reviews, for example, of the embassy's development assistance portfolios and guidance on risk management. But there's a need for much greater uptake of this kind of initiatives across the board. In many cases, as I was saying, the private sector is well ahead of the curve. WRI has invested heavily in platforms such as those that you see here, as well as governments like Norway. Investments like the platforms like the Tropical Forest Alliance, the Consumer Goods Forum, Champions 12.3, are really evidencing the kind of momentum and the kind of coalitions that I spoke to earlier that are needed to drive this change. But much more is needed around the world and across different sectors. I really subscribe to the call for advancing both standardized as well as mandatory ESG reporting. To date, more than 92% of the world's largest companies, 250 of them, report on their sustainability performance through different metrics. And there's really clear and mounting evidence that the positive link between the application of ESG metrics and improved corporate finance performance is clear. So there is, as well as the work that we've been doing through the new climate economy, I think a strong and emerging narrative of the fact that delivering on the SDGs, delivering on climate, and really speaking, and not just doing corporate social responsibility as something that you tick, but that is embedded in your corporate performance, makes economic sense and pays dividends. But there's much more needed to accomplish that. I would point to a good initiative where we're starting to see real momentum, and it speaks to the fact of companies really stepping up. And this is the Science-Based Targets initiative. We have already 372 companies, and the number's ticking up very, very quickly. And these are companies that have adopted science-based targets that are in line with the level of decarbonization needed to stay well under 2 degrees. So these are companies that have taken on targets and are holding themselves accountable. And that is the kind of leadership that we need. I was in Colombia just about 2 weeks ago meeting with the ministers and of planning, with ministers of environment, and they were very concerned about the same question that John asked earlier. How do we get the private sector to step up? And they're very keen to see how the Science-Based Target Initiative, for example, can help more companies really step up to it. And I think that another area that I think is quite important is making sure that private sector knows that what they do matters. It's counted, but it's also acknowledged. So WRI is working with the UNFCCC, working with Mission 2020, and a whole array of partners, for example, to develop a global standard for aggregating non-state actors' contributions to the battle on climate change. And this is very important. We already have the NASCA platform where we see a lot of governments and a lot of companies and non-state actors coming forward with their pledges. But how this is aggregated in a way that is meaningful is important. So we're really looking forward to working with many on this global standard so that that can matter. Because I think a challenge ahead is to engage SMEs. It's fantastic when we have these major global corporations, but leaving no one behind is also about making sure that all of the sectors feel equally included in this agenda, and bringing on board SMEs where 70% of the jobs are generated is going to be one of the challenges and the opportunities of this agenda. So the question now is, how do we align the climate and the SDGs agendas? How can we really maximize the delivery of those? And I would say that what we need now is really to change how we frame the development challenges. Just as we're asking private sector to look beyond just immediate short-term gains, I think we are also needing to frame questions in a way that the solutions are not prioritized to favor short-term visions. Are these long-term trade-offs understood? The distributional efforts. What about gender? How is gender being equated and involved? And according to our research at WRI, NDCs contribute to meeting 154 of the 169 targets of the 2030 agenda. So there's enormous potential for very rich and very real policy coherence. It's not there yet, but we're seeing good movement. What are some of the challenges that remain and the opportunities? I want to very quickly highlight 4. One is that the translation of the SDGs into sectoral and national development plans and budgets still remains very, very superficial. There's not much more beyond the kind of mapping of the linkages between the SDG targets and the priorities, as we can see, for example, in this slide. In some, there's actually, I would say, backwards. One country, for example, has reclustered the SDGs into economic, social, and environment pillars. Exactly why we created the SDGs was to get away from the word pillars and even the sense of these narrow sectors. Another country has pooled transformational SDG targets into something called green growth, and then there's something completely separate looking at governance, and another one that is looking at social inclusion. Again, we go back to this sense of comfort in creating these pillars. But there are good practices. Ethiopia, for example, has tried to use the SDGs as a guiding framework in the development of its second growth and a transformational plan. So a lot of work and a lot of opportunities for collaboration, for working with NORAD and with others to really help translate the SDGs into development plans and budgets in ways that matter. I think a second chance is the need and challenge is that governments are really struggling to implement their NDCs. So it's not just that the SDGs are not embedded, they're really trying to figure out how to implement the SDGs. And one of the things, speaking with the support unit of the NDC partnership, which is hosted at WRI, is that there's very few requests coming in from governments to help them align these two agendas. They're not even seeing the potential and the need to align these agendas, which is really regrettable because to the degree that you can understand the socioeconomic dividends of, for example, climate action, it's going to be more likely prioritized and more deeply developed. So there's real opportunities here, and this is an example of work that we've been doing in helping, for example, Mexico map out what are the most optimal policy packages for both conditional and unconditional pledges in a way that can help them deliver on their agenda. Finally, I would say that a very key issue is the long-term perspectives. What we're seeing is that there's a concern over locking into path dependencies that are going to be very high in emissions and are going to lock out development options. But this concept usually refers to infrastructure, especially in energy. And I would say that one of the things we need to really do is to understand that also when we look at land use, there is lock-in. When you look at the cumulative direct and indirect impacts of landscape changes, this is also lock-in. And I think this is a conversation that we need to be having had around land use change and what it means for both the climate as well as the sustainable development agenda. WRI is working very hard to really roll out case studies, expert perspectives to help governments understand the need for a long-term perspective. It's an arena where we're collaborating with the Platform 2050s initiative and where we see a lot of opportunities for collaboration. A last one that I would mention has to do with adaptation. There's a real, finance is still very much skewed in favor of mitigation options, and given the urgency, that is right. But we have to help countries identify approaches and pipelines for tackling climate impacts. I think that this is a huge opportunity for both public and private sector at this moment. And we really want to understand how have countries started to mainstream adaptations, what are the hallmarks of effective mainstreaming, and to what extent is finance being mobilized and what are the opportunities there. And obviously, in cases where adaptation is not possible, where it exceeds the possibilities of countries, we really will have to start looking at issues around loss and damage. And in the final 3 seconds, let me just say that the action at subnational level is really where the greatest potential lies. And this is evident in the C40's initiatives, in things like America's Pledge. But the focus is still very much, in terms of NDCs and SDGs at this point, on looking at national level. That's where the finance and the support is flowing. So again, we would be looking very much forward to collaborating and to working to really unpack and to help drive forward action, not just at national, but also at subnational level. Thank you very much.